They wanted to help kids sit still in class. They created a generation that can't function without daily amphetamines. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a pill that was supposed to fix fidgety children, but ended up creating millions of adult addicts who can't function without their daily dose of pharmaceutical speed. Ritalin, the innocent-sounding medication that doctors prescribed to second graders in the 1990s like candy. The same drug college students now crush and snort in library bathrooms at 3 a.m. before finals. A stimulant designed for 6-year-olds that somehow became the performance enhancer of choice for lawyers, executives, and anyone trying to survive in a world that demands superhuman focus. The medical establishment called it treatment. What they actually created was a generation chemically dependent on amphetamines before they were old enough to understand what dependency meant. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand how Ritalin became America's most prescribed brain drug, you first need to understand that it was never supposed to exist at all. The year was 1944, and Leandro Panisson was just another chemist grinding through compounds in a Basel laboratory. Ciba Pharmaceutical Company employed him to synthesize derivatives of amphetamine, that wonderful stimulant the military had been feeding to soldiers to keep them awake during night raids. Panisson's job was simple: take the amphetamine molecule, twist it slightly, add different chemical groups, and see what happened. Most attempts produced nothing interesting. Some made people nauseous. A few caused heart palpitations severe enough to end the experiment immediately. Panisson worked methodically, like a chef trying variations on a recipe. Replace this carbon chain with that one. Swap this oxygen atom for nitrogen. Each modification created a slightly different drug with unpredictable effects. The war was ending, which meant pharmaceutical companies were racing to find the next commercial miracle. Penicillin had proven that chemicals could save lives and generate massive profits simultaneously. Every company wanted their own blockbuster discovery. Ciba's management pushed for results. Panisson synthesized compound after compound, documenting effects in laboratory notebooks with neat handwriting. Most failed to show promise. Then he created a molecule he labeled as pipradrol derivative number something or other. The exact number lost to history, but the chemical structure preserved. This particular arrangement of atoms did something interesting to the brain's dopamine system, though Panisson had no way of knowing that in 1944. Neurochemistry was still primitive. Scientists barely understood neurotransmitters existed. What Panisson did have was a wife with chronically low blood pressure. Marguerite Panisson, nicknamed Rita by everyone who knew her, suffered from fatigue and dizziness. Standing up too quickly made her lightheaded. Physical exertion exhausted her. She had tried various medications without success. Leandro, being both a devoted husband and a scientist with access to experimental drugs, occasionally brought compounds home for her to test. This was the 1940s, when human experimentation followed loose guidelines at best. Informed consent meant, "Here, try this and tell me how you feel." Rita became her husband's unofficial research subject. She swallowed pills before tennis matches, before social events, before anything requiring energy. Most compounds did nothing or made her feel worse. But one particular molecule, the one Leandro had recently synthesized, produced remarkable effects. Rita took it before a tennis game and suddenly found herself playing with unusual intensity. Her focus sharpened. Fatigue disappeared. The usual mental fog that accompanied low blood pressure lifted completely. She won the match. Leandro noticed the change immediately. Rita described feeling alert but not jittery, energized but not anxious. The compound seemed to occupy a sweet spot between coffee and amphetamine. She started taking it regularly before tennis matches, and her game improved consistently. Other players commented on her newfound competitiveness. Rita attributed it to training, but Leandro knew better. His experimental compound was doing something powerful to her brain chemistry. The chemist named his creation after his wife. Methylphenidate, a technical name that preserved Rita in its syllables while sounding properly pharmaceutical. The gesture seemed romantic at the time, a scientist immortalizing his beloved in chemistry. Neither could have predicted that this molecule would eventually enter the bloodstreams of tens of millions of children and adults, or that Rita's name would become synonymous with a drug that would reshape how society views childhood behavior and adult productivity. CIBA Pharmaceutical took notice of Panisen's compound. Internal testing showed promising results for various conditions. The drug increased alertness without the harsh side effects of pure amphetamine. It seemed smoother, more controlled. Company researchers began formal trials, testing it on patients with different ailments. Depression, fatigue, narcolepsy, they tried everything. Results varied wildly. Some patients reported dramatic improvements. Others felt nothing. A few experienced unpleasant side effects that ended their participation. The inconsistency frustrated CIBA's research division. A good drug produces predictable results across most patients. Methylphenidate seemed almost selective in who it helped. The company couldn't identify a clear pattern. Meanwhile, competing pharmaceutical firms were releasing their own stimulants and antidepressants. CIBA needed to move faster or risk losing market position. In 1954, they filed for a patent on methylphenidate, still uncertain about its best application, but unwilling to let a potentially valuable compound go unprotected. The patent described methylphenidate as useful for treating depressive states, psychoneuroses, and narcolepsy. These were catch-all categories that covered enormous patient populations. CIBA's strategy was clear: patent broadly, figure out the specifics later. The US Patent Office approved the application. CIBA now owned exclusive rights to manufacture and sell methylphenidate for the next 17 years. They just needed to find the right market. Initial marketing targeted adults with depression and chronic fatigue. CIBA branded the drug as Ritalin, keeping Rita's name while making it sound clinical and professional. Sales representatives visited doctors' offices with samples and literature. The pitch emphasized Ritalin's gentler profile compared to amphetamines. It wouldn't make patients jittery or manic. It simply helped them focus and maintain energy throughout the day. Doctors prescribed it cautiously. Patients reported mixed results. The drug worked, but inconsistently. Some people felt dramatically better. Others noticed minimal effects. Ritalin became a minor player in CIBA's product lineup, profitable enough to keep manufacturing but hardly the blockbuster they'd hoped for. Then someone made an observation that changed everything. The identity of this person remains disputed. Possibly a psychiatrist, maybe a pediatrician, perhaps a researcher reviewing trial data. Whoever they were noticed something peculiar in how hyperactive children responded to Ritalin. Adults taking the drug felt more alert and energetic, exactly as expected from a stimulant. But children who couldn't sit still, who fidgeted constantly, who drove their teachers to exhaustion, these children became calmer. The stimulant produced opposite effects depending on the patient's age and brain chemistry. This made no logical sense. Stimulants stimulate. That's literally what the word means. Giving a hyperactive child a stimulant should make them more hyperactive, like pouring gasoline on a fire. Yet the opposite occurred. Fidgety children became focused. Impulsive children gained self-control. Distracted children could suddenly pay attention for extended periods. The paradox fascinated and confused researchers in equal measure. Charles Bradley had documented similar effects in the 1930s when he'd given amphetamines to problem children at his Rhode Island hospital. His study showed that stimulants paradoxically calmed certain children, improving their behaviour and academic performance. But Bradley's work had been largely ignored by mainstream medicine. The idea of giving children amphetamines seemed bizarre and potentially dangerous. His research faded into obscurity as World War II dominated everyone's attention. Now, 20 years later, CIBA's researchers were rediscovering Bradley's findings. Methylphenidate produced the same paradoxical calming effect on hyperactive children. But unlike Bradley's amphetamines, Ritalin came from a major pharmaceutical company, with resources for large-scale trials and marketing campaigns. CIBA recognized the opportunity immediately. Depression medication for adults was a crowded market. But a treatment specifically for hyperactive children, that was virgin territory. The company shifted its research focus. New trials specifically targeted children diagnosed with hyperactivity. The results were striking. Teachers reported dramatic behavioral improvements. Parents said their children could finally sit through dinner without bouncing off walls. Schools that had considered expelling disruptive students now saw those same children completing assignments and following instructions. Ritalin didn't just calm children, it transformed them into manageable students. CIBA prepared to apply for FDA approval for this new indication. The application would need to clearly define which children should receive the medication. But therein lay a problem. Nobody really understood what hyperactivity was. No blood test could diagnose it. No brain scan revealed it. The condition existed entirely in observation. Subjective judgments by adults about whether a child's behaviour fell within acceptable ranges. One teacher might see normal childhood energy. Another might see pathological hyperactivity. The diagnosis depended entirely on who was watching and what they considered normal. This subjectivity didn't concern CIBA's executives. Vague diagnoses meant broader markets. If the criteria for hyperactivity were loose enough, millions of children might qualify for treatment. The company moved forward with its application, framing Ritalin as a solution to a growing problem in American schools and homes. They positioned the drug as help for struggling children, not as a tool for managing inconvenient behaviour. The distinction would prove meaningless in practice, but it sounded better in medical journals and advertising copy. In 1955, CIBA received preliminary approval to market Ritalin for what they termed functional behavioural problems in children. The diagnosis remained maddeningly vague. The FDA didn't seem to care. Post-war America trusted pharmaceutical companies and medical authorities. If doctors said a drug was safe and effective, most people believed them. Skepticism about medications hadn't yet entered mainstream consciousness. Thalidomide's birth defect scandal was still years away. The FDA operated with minimal oversight and limited resources. Drug approvals came relatively easily compared to modern standards. CIBA began manufacturing Ritalin tablets specifically for children. Small white pills, scored down the middle for easy splitting. 5 mg and 10 mg doses. Instructions recommended starting low and adjusting based on response. The prescribing information listed possible side effects: decreased appetite, trouble sleeping, stomach upset. Nothing too alarming. The warnings about addiction and dependency were minimal. This was methylphenidate, not heroin. It came from a legitimate pharmaceutical company with a patent and FDA approval. How dangerous could it be? Initial prescriptions remained modest. Doctors were uncertain about giving stimulants to children despite the approval. Parents worried about side effects and long-term consequences. School administrators hesitated to recommend medication for behavioral problems. Ritalin existed on the market but hadn't yet found its moment. CIBA's sales disappointed expectations. The company had discovered a drug that could fundamentally alter childhood behavior, but American society wasn't quite ready to embrace that possibility. That would change within a decade. The seeds had been planted. A pharmaceutical solution existed for children who couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, couldn't meet adult expectations for behavior. All that was needed was the right cultural moment, the right marketing approach, and the right redefinition of what constituted normal childhood. The 1960s would provide all three. The 1950s transformed America into a nation obsessed with conformity. Suburbs sprawled across former farmland, identical houses arranged in precise rows. Families moved from cramped urban apartments to spacious homes with yards and garages. This physical expansion came with strict social expectations. Children were supposed to be seen, not heard. Wives maintained spotless homes. Husbands commuted to corporate jobs. Everyone followed the same script, deviation from which marked you as problematic or potentially dangerous. Childhood itself became standardized during this period. The previous generation had grown up during the Depression and War, when children worked farms or helped in family businesses. Play happened in streets and empty lots with minimal adult supervision. Kids entertained themselves, fought their own battles, resolved their own conflicts. Parents intervened rarely. But suburban prosperity changed everything. Childhood became structured, supervised, and regulated according to expert advice found in parenting magazines and pediatrician handbooks. Schools expanded rapidly to accommodate the baby boom. Districts constructed massive new buildings designed for efficiency and order. Classrooms held 30 or 40 students arranged in neat rows. Teachers maintained discipline through strict rules and swift punishment. The educational philosophy emphasized silence, obedience, and sitting still for extended periods. Students who couldn't conform disrupted the entire system. A single fidgety child could derail a lesson for 40 others. Boys suffered most under this new regime. Previous generations had expected boys to be rowdy, physical, and energetic. That was simply how boys were. But modern schools had no tolerance for such behavior. 6 hours of sitting still, raising your hand, waiting your turn, this became the standard expectation. Boys who ran when they should walk, who shouted when they should whisper, who fidgeted when they should sit, became problems requiring solutions. Pediatricians began hearing the same complaints repeatedly. Teachers sent notes home about children who couldn't focus. Mothers reported exhaustion from managing sons who never stopped moving. Fathers worried their boys lacked discipline. The complaints followed patterns, usually boys between 6 and 12, usually described as bright but unable to concentrate, usually driving adults to frustration. Doctors had no clear explanation. Were these children sick, spoiled, poorly parented? Nobody knew for certain. Medical literature started using terms like hyperkinetic impulse disorder and minimal brain dysfunction. These labels sounded scientific and legitimate despite having no biological basis. No brain scan could detect minimal brain dysfunction. No blood test revealed hyperkinetic impulses. The diagnoses rested entirely on adult observations of childhood behavior. Teachers filled out checklists. Parents described symptoms. Doctors made judgments based on subjective reports. The entire diagnostic process was circular. Children behaved in ways adults found problematic. Therefore they had a disorder. Therefore they needed treatment. In 1957, the FDA expanded Ritalin's approved uses to include hyperactivity, chronic fatigue, and depression. The approval came with minimal scrutiny. Drug regulation was still relatively lax. The FDA trusted pharmaceutical companies to conduct their own safety testing. CIBA had submitted studies showing Ritalin helped hyperactive children without serious side effects. The agency saw no reason to deny approval. The medication seemed relatively harmless, less dangerous than barbiturates, less addictive than amphetamines, less severe than electroshock therapy. Early prescriptions remained cautious. Most doctors preferred behavioral interventions over medication. They suggested stricter discipline, more exercise, reduced sugar intake. Parents tried various approaches with mixed results. Some children improved with structure and routine. Others continued bouncing off walls regardless of parenting techniques. Frustrated families eventually returned to their pediatricians asking for stronger solutions. Ritalin emerged as the option of last resort. SIBA recognized it needed better marketing to expand Ritalin's market share. The company began targeting pediatricians with detailed literature about hyperactivity. Sales representatives visited medical offices bearing free samples and glossy brochures. The marketing materials framed medication as compassionate and progressive. Refusing to treat hyperactive children wasn't protecting them. It was allowing them to suffer unnecessarily. Would you withhold insulin from a diabetic? Would you deny antibiotics to a child with pneumonia? Hyperactivity was a medical condition requiring medical treatment. Ritalin was that treatment. The messaging proved remarkably effective. Doctors who initially resisted prescribing stimulants to children gradually changed their positions. The pharmaceutical company provided scientific-sounding explanations for how Ritalin worked. It corrected chemical imbalances in the brain. It helped children reach their full potential. It transformed struggling students into successful ones. These claims had minimal scientific backing, but they sounded authoritative. Doctors trusted the information because it came from a major pharmaceutical company with FDA approval. Schools became unexpected allies in expanding Ritalin use. Teachers dealt with overcrowded classrooms and limited resources. Disruptive students consumed disproportionate time and attention. A single hyperactive child could prevent 30 others from learning effectively. Teachers began recommending that parents speak with doctors about medication. Some schools required medical evaluations before allowing particularly disruptive students to continue attending. The line between educational management and medical diagnosis blurred completely. Parents faced intense pressure from multiple directions. Teachers suggested their children needed evaluation. Doctors confirmed diagnoses based on teacher reports. Other parents whispered that medication had transformed their own difficult children. The social stigma around medicating children was gradually disappearing, replaced by stigma around refusing treatment. Good parents addressed their children's problems. Bad parents let them suffer untreated. This false dichotomy pushed thousands of families toward pharmaceutical solutions. CIBA expanded its marketing reach throughout the early 1960s. The company created educational films for schools showing the dramatic benefits of Ritalin treatment. Before and after footage showed the same child, first fidgety and distracted, then calm and focused after medication. The films neglected to mention that any stimulant would produce similar effects in any child, whether hyperactive or not. They presented Ritalin as specifically treating a disease, not as a drug that altered normal brain chemistry. Medical conferences featured SIBA-sponsored presentations on hyperactivity treatment. Researchers whose studies were funded by the pharmaceutical company presented data showing dramatic improvements in classroom behavior. The studies rarely examined long-term effects or compared medication to other interventions. They measured narrow outcomes, time spent sitting still, assignments completed, teacher satisfaction ratings. By these metrics, Ritalin worked brilliantly. Whether those metrics actually indicated improved child well-being was a question nobody asked. The diagnosis itself kept evolving and expanding. Initial definitions focused on extreme hyperactivity, children who literally could not stop moving. But as awareness spread, the criteria broadened. Daydreaming became a symptom. Forgetting homework became evidence of disorder. Preferring outdoor play to desk work indicated possible pathology. The diagnostic net widened until it could catch almost any child whose behaviour annoyed adults. By 1970, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 American children took Ritalin daily. The number represented a massive increase from just a decade earlier. School nurses kept bottles in their offices, dispensing pills to students at scheduled times. Teachers learned to recognize which children took medication and when their doses wore off. The practice became normalized, just another part of modern education, like textbooks and cafeteria lunches. But backlash was building. Parent groups began questioning whether schools were overdiagnosing to avoid addressing their own failures. Were children hyperactive, or were classrooms poorly designed? Did boys have disorders, or did schools expect feminine behavioral patterns? Some doctors grew concerned about medicating millions of children based on subjective observations. Civil rights activists saw racial disparities in diagnosis rates, with black and low-income children disproportionately labelled as hyperactive and medicated. Congressional hearings in 1970 investigated stimulant use in schools. Representative Cornelius Gallagher led inquiries into whether children were being medicated for the convenience of adults rather than their own benefit. Testimony revealed disturbing patterns. Some schools threatened to expel students whose parents refused medication. Teachers with no medical training were effectively diagnosing conditions and recommending drugs. Pharmaceutical companies were profiting enormously, while children were being turned into test subjects for long-term drug effects nobody fully understood. The hearings generated significant media coverage. Newspapers ran stories about drugged school children and profit-driven pharmaceutical companies. Parents who had unquestioningly accepted doctor recommendations began having doubts. Prescription rates temporarily plateaued as doctors became more cautious about diagnosing hyperactivity. Ciba's stock price dipped. The company released statements defending Ritalin's safety and necessity, while quietly reducing its most aggressive marketing tactics. But the fundamental system remained intact. Ritalin stayed on the market with FDA approval. The diagnosis of hyperactivity continued existing despite its vague criteria. Schools still struggled with overcrowding and limited resources. Parents still wanted solutions for difficult children. Doctors still had prescription pads. The controversy faded from headlines after a few months, and prescription rates resumed their upward climb. What the 1960s had established couldn't be easily dismantled. American society had accepted several crucial premises: that childhood behavior problems were medical conditions, that medications could treat those conditions, that refusing treatment was neglectful, and that pharmaceutical companies were trustworthy authorities on child development. These beliefs would persist and strengthen over coming decades. The question was no longer whether to medicate hyperactive children, but how many children qualified for the diagnosis and how long they should take the drugs. CIBA had successfully created a market where none existed before. Childhood energy and inattention, traits that had always existed, were now pathologized and treated with daily medication. The company had transformed normal variation in childhood behavior into a medical condition requiring pharmaceutical intervention. This achievement would prove incredibly profitable. More importantly, it established a template other pharmaceutical companies would follow: define the disease broadly, market aggressively, target vulnerable populations, and normalize long-term drug use. The children prescribed Ritalin in the 1960s were guinea pigs in an uncontrolled experiment. Nobody knew what happened when you gave stimulants to developing brains for years at a time. The studies showing safety were short-term, weeks or months, not years or decades. Would these children develop normally? Would they become dependent on medication? Would their brain chemistry be permanently altered? These questions had no answers because the experiment was still ongoing. The results wouldn't be known for another generation. The 1970s backlash had frightened CIBA's executives, but taught them valuable lessons about managing public perception. Aggressive marketing created visibility and controversy. Subtle marketing achieved the same results without attracting congressional attention. The company shifted tactics, moving from direct-to-consumer advertising toward educational campaigns that positioned Ritalin as an established medical necessity rather than a controversial new treatment. Doctors needed to believe they were making independent clinical decisions, not following pharmaceutical company suggestions. CIBA created the Medical Information Department specifically to manage Ritalin's image. This division produced educational materials disguised as objective medical resources. Pamphlets explaining hyperactivity in children went to pediatrician offices across America. The literature never mentioned CIBA or explicitly promoted Ritalin. Instead, it educated doctors about recognizing symptoms, understanding the biological basis of the disorder, and considering treatment options. Ritalin appeared as one option among several, though the material subtly emphasized its effectiveness and safety compared to alternatives. Schools received their own targeted materials. CIBA developed teacher training guides that helped educators identify potential hyperactivity cases. The guides included checklists and symptom descriptions that turned subjective observations into seemingly objective assessments. A child who fidgets during math class scored points on the checklist. One who daydreams during reading scored more points. Enough points triggered a recommendation for medical evaluation. Teachers appreciated having clear guidelines. They didn't realize those guidelines came from a company with financial incentives to expand diagnosis rates. The symptom checklists were masterpieces of diagnostic expansion. Almost any childhood behavior could indicate possible hyperactivity depending on interpretation. Talks excessively, possible hyperactivity. Unusually quiet, also possible hyperactivity. The inattentive subtype. Performs poorly in school, definitely suspicious. Performs well but doesn't reach full potential, equally concerning. The criteria were deliberately vague enough to capture enormous numbers of children, while sounding specific enough to seem legitimate. Medical conferences became crucial battlegrounds for shaping professional opinion. CIBA sponsored symposiums on childhood behavioral disorders, funding researchers to present papers on hyperactivity treatment. The company didn't dictate conclusions, but it carefully selected which researchers received funding. Scientists producing favorable results got grants for additional studies. Those questioning Ritalin's effectiveness found funding mysteriously unavailable. This created a publication bias where medical journals filled with positive studies while negative findings remained unpublished in filing cabinets. Dr. Paul Wender became CIBA's most valuable asset, though he genuinely believed in his research rather than consciously shilling for pharmaceutical interests. His work at the University of Utah established hyperactivity as a legitimate neurological condition with genetic components. Wender's studies showed that hyperactive children had different brain chemistry than normal children. His conclusions supported the idea that medication wasn't drugging children into submission, it was correcting biological abnormalities. CIBA ensured Wender's research received wide distribution in medical journals and conferences. The biological framing proved crucial for expanding Ritalin use. Parents could accept medicating their children if the problem was physical rather than behavioral. A chemical imbalance wasn't anyone's fault, not the parents, not the teacher's, not the child's. It simply existed and required pharmaceutical correction, like diabetes requiring insulin or infections requiring antibiotics. This narrative removed guilt while creating demand for treatment. Mothers who previously resisted medicating their sons now asked doctors for prescriptions, worried they were neglecting a biological problem. Pharmaceutical advertising regulations tightened during the 1970s, restricting how companies could market medications. CIBA adapted by funding patient advocacy groups that could say things the company legally couldn't. Organizations like Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Disorder, CHAD, emerged, created and sustained by pharmaceutical money while maintaining the appearance of grassroots independence. These groups lobbied for insurance coverage, fought stigma around medication, and pushed for accommodations in schools. Their messaging aligned perfectly with CIBA's interests while coming from seemingly neutral sources. Insurance companies initially resisted covering ADHD medications, viewing the diagnosis as too subjective to warrant reimbursement. But sustained pressure from advocacy groups, combined with growing medical consensus around hyperactivity as a legitimate disorder, gradually changed their position. Major insurers began covering Ritalin prescriptions in the late 1970s. This decision removed a significant barrier to treatment. Parents who couldn't afford medication out of pocket could now get it covered. Prescription rates jumped immediately after major insurers changed their policies. Generic manufacturers began producing methylphenidate once CIBA's original patents expired. The company had anticipated this and developed extended-release formulations with new patents. These versions released medication slowly throughout the day, eliminating the need for schools to administer midday doses. CIBA marketed the convenience to parents and educators. Children wouldn't miss class time visiting the nurse. They wouldn't face embarrassment about taking medication in front of peers. One morning pill provided all-day coverage. The extended-release formulations cost more than generics, but CIBA convinced insurance companies they were worth the premium. Fewer doses meant better compliance, which meant better outcomes, which meant lower costs long-term. This argument was largely speculative, but insurers accepted it. Extended-release Ritalin became the preferred prescription, keeping CIBA's profits high despite generic competition. The company had successfully extended its monopoly through minor pharmaceutical modifications. Media coverage gradually shifted from skeptical to accepting. Early 1970s articles questioned whether millions of children really needed medication. By the early 1980s, stories focused on underdiagnosis. How many children suffered needlessly because parents didn't recognize their symptoms or seek treatment? This narrative reversal didn't happen accidentally. CIBA's public relations team cultivated relationships with health journalists, providing them with expert sources and story angles. Reporters who wrote skeptical pieces found fewer experts willing to comment. Those who wrote sympathetic stories got exclusive access to researchers and patient success stories. Television coverage proved especially valuable. News programs ran features on hyperactive children whose lives improved dramatically after diagnosis and treatment. The stories followed predictable patterns: failing student, frustrated parents, difficult behavior at home and school, then medication, then transformation into successful, happy child. These narratives were genuine. Ritalin did help many children. But the media coverage ignored children who didn't respond well, who developed side effects, or who became dependent on medication. The result was a systematically distorted public perception of the drug's benefits and risks. Prescription rates climbed steadily through the late 1970s and accelerated in the 1980s. What started as 150,000 children in 1970 grew to over 500,000 by 1980. then approached 1 million by 1985. Each milestone prompted hand-wringing articles about overdiagnosis, followed by reassurances from medical authorities that increased awareness was simply identifying previously untreated cases. The climbing numbers never triggered serious re-evaluation of diagnostic criteria or prescription practices. They were simply accepted as evidence that hyperactivity was more common than previously recognized. Regional variations in diagnosis rates reveal the subjective nature of the disorder. Some school districts medicated 15% of male students. Others in demographically similar areas medicated only 2%. These massive disparities suggested diagnosis depended more on local culture and school resources than on actual prevalence of biological brain disorders. But national statistics obscured these local variations. Aggregated data made the epidemic appear uniform rather than clustered in districts with particular educational philosophies or insufficient special education resources. CIBA's marketing reached beyond doctors and schools to shape popular culture. Parenting magazines ran articles about recognizing hyperactivity symptoms. Self-help books for managing difficult children recommended medical evaluation. Sitcoms featured hyperactive characters who became more likable after treatment. This cultural saturation normalized the idea that energetic, inattentive children needed medication. Parents who resisted diagnosis and treatment increasingly seemed neglectful rather than cautious. The company also marketed internationally, exporting American diagnostic categories and treatment approaches to other countries. European physicians were initially skeptical about medicating children for behavioral problems, but CIBA adapted its educational materials for different markets, emphasizing the same biological explanations and treatment successes. Prescription rates in countries like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom began climbing, though they never reached American levels. Cultural differences in how societies viewed childhood behavior created resistance to full medicalization. Schools became de facto diagnostic centers despite teachers having no medical training. Special education evaluations routinely included assessments for hyperactivity. School psychologists administered rating scales to teachers and parents, compiled scores, and made recommendations for medical follow-up. The evaluation process appeared thorough and professional, but it fundamentally relied on subjective adult judgments about acceptable childhood behavior. A strict teacher scored children higher on hyperactivity scales than a lenient one. An overwhelmed parent rated their child as more problematic than a relaxed one. The rising prescriptions created their own justification. As more children took medication, the practice seemed more normal and acceptable. Parents whose children took Ritalin became advocates, sharing success stories and encouraging other parents to seek evaluation. Nobody wanted to be the stubborn holdout denying their child help that clearly worked for so many others. This social proof was more powerful than any advertising campaign. When your neighbor's kid improved after starting medication, pharmaceutical marketing became unnecessary. Financial incentives aligned throughout the system. Pharmaceutical companies profited from prescriptions. Doctors got paid for evaluations and follow-up appointments. Schools avoided expensive special education services by recommending medication instead. Insurance companies found pills cheaper than therapy. Parents got manageable children. Teachers got orderly classrooms. Everyone benefited except possibly the children themselves, whose long-term outcomes remained unknown and unstudied. By 1990, over 6 million American children took Ritalin or similar stimulants daily. The number represented roughly 10% of school-age children, with boys outnumbering girls 4-1. This was no longer a treatment for rare, severe cases. It had become a routine intervention for common childhood behaviors. The normalization was complete. Ritalin had transformed from controversial psychiatric medication to standard educational tool as unremarkable as textbooks or school lunches. The marketing machine had achieved total victory. Prozac arrived in 1987 and changed everything about how Americans understood their own minds. Eli Lilly's antidepressant became a cultural phenomenon within months of FDA approval. Millions of people discovered their depression wasn't a character flaw or personal weakness, but a chemical imbalance correctable with a daily pill. Magazine covers proclaimed the dawn of cosmetic psychopharmacology. Therapy sessions decreased while prescription rates soared. The brain was just another organ that sometimes malfunctioned and required pharmaceutical adjustment. This paradigm shift rippled through psychiatry and created legitimacy for every medication targeting brain chemistry. If serotonin imbalances cause depression, then dopamine imbalances could explain hyperactivity. The biological model of mental illness became dominant, pushing aside psychological and social explanations. Parents who felt guilty about medicating children could now reframe the decision as treating a neurological condition. Teachers who worried about overdiagnosing could point to brain imaging studies showing physical differences. The shame evaporated, replaced by medical authority. That same year, the American Psychiatric Association released the revised third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The update renamed attention deficit disorder, with hyperactivity as attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. This seemed like minor administrative housekeeping, but fundamentally transformed the diagnosis. The new criteria specified 3 subtypes: predominantly hyperactive, predominantly inattentive, and combined. This expansion captured children who weren't hyperactive at all, but simply daydreamed or forgot things. Girls suddenly qualified for diagnosis at much higher rates. The DSM-3R criteria listed 18 possible symptoms, requiring only 6 for diagnosis. The symptoms themselves were vague enough to apply to almost anyone, often fails to give close attention to details, often has difficulty sustaining attention, often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. Normal childhood behaviours became pathological when they occurred, often according to adult observers. The manual provided no objective measures for often, leaving interpretation entirely subjective. A strict parent might see pathology where a lenient one saw normal development. Neuroimaging technology advanced rapidly during the late 1980s and provided visual evidence that seemed to validate ADHD as a real biological condition. PET scans and fMR studies showed differences in brain activity between children diagnosed with ADHD and control groups. Regions involved in executive function and impulse control showed reduced activity in ADHD brains. These images were powerful, tangible proof that something physical was different about these children's brains. The fact that the differences might be caused by environmental factors or normal variation rather than disease didn't diminish their rhetorical impact. Researchers identified dopamine as the key neurotransmitter involved in ADHD. The brain's reward and motivation circuits depended on proper dopamine signaling. Children with ADHD appeared to have underactive dopamine systems, making it harder for them to focus on boring tasks or delay gratification. Ritalin worked by blocking dopamine reuptake, allowing the neurotransmitter to accumulate in synapses and compensate for the deficit. This explanation was elegant, scientific sounding, and mostly speculative. The actual neurobiology of ADHD remained poorly understood, but the dopamine hypothesis provided a convenient framework for explaining both the disorder and the treatment. Pharmaceutical companies seized on this neurobiological framing with enthusiasm. Advertisements featured brain scans alongside images of children struggling in school. The message was clear: ADHD was as real as diabetes or asthma. It had a biological basis visible in medical imaging. It required medical treatment. Refusing medication wasn't protecting children from drugs. It was denying them necessary health care. This reframing proved devastatingly effective at overcoming remaining parental resistance. Parent advocacy groups grew larger and more influential throughout the early 1990s. Organizations like CHAD expanded from small support groups to national organizations with significant political power. They lobbied Congress for disability protections, fought for school accommodations, and pushed back against any suggestion that ADHD was overdiagnosed or overmedicated. Many families genuinely benefited from diagnosis and treatment, and their gratitude translated into fierce advocacy. The fact that pharmaceutical companies quietly funded these organizations went largely unnoticed by members. Insurance coverage expanded significantly as ADHD gained legitimacy as a medical diagnosis. Companies that previously refused coverage or limited prescriptions now provided full benefits for stimulant medications. Mental health parity laws in various states required insurers to cover psychiatric medications at the same level as physical health treatments. These regulatory changes removed cost as a barrier to medication, unleashing massive increases in prescription rates. Families who couldn't previously afford treatment suddenly had access. Schools began providing formal accommodations for students with ADHD diagnoses under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the newly passed Americans with Disabilities Act. Extra time on tests, preferential seating, reduced homework loads. These accommodations gave diagnosed students significant advantages. This created perverse incentives for seeking diagnosis even when symptoms were minimal. Parents realized an ADHD diagnosis provided educational benefits beyond just medication. Some actively sought diagnoses primarily for the accommodations rather than treatment. Prescription rates exploded through the 1990s. The 6 million children taking stimulants in 1990 became 8 million by 1995 and approached 12 million by 2000. The increase wasn't gradual, it was exponential. Every year brought new records. Pharmaceutical companies couldn't manufacture medication fast enough to meet demand. Shortages occurred regularly, forcing pharmacies to ration pills and prioritize long-term patients over new prescriptions. The stimulant market had become a multi-billion-dollar industry. Generic methylphenidate manufacturers proliferated as older patents expired. But brand-name companies like Novartis, which had acquired CBA, maintained dominance through aggressive marketing of new formulations. Concerta, an extended-release version using osmotic pump technology, arrived in 2000 and quickly captured market share. The medication used a clever delivery system that pushed active drug through a laser-drilled hole at a controlled rate. This prevented crushing and snorting, theoretically reducing abuse potential. It also justified premium pricing. Adderall emerged as Ritalin's main competitor. The drug combined 4 different amphetamine salts into a single pill, providing smoother effects than older formulations. Shire Pharmaceuticals marketed it aggressively to doctors and parents, positioning it as superior to Ritalin despite minimal evidence of actual advantage. The marketing worked. Adderall prescriptions climbed rapidly through the late 1990s. Having multiple brand options paradoxically increased overall stimulant use. Doctors prescribed whichever medication pharmaceutical reps most recently promoted, and reps promoted vigorously. Strattera arrived in 2002 as the first non-stimulant medication approved for ADHD. The drug worked through different neurochemical mechanisms, affecting norepinephrine rather than dopamine. Eli Lilly promoted it as safer than stimulants, without abuse potential or scheduling restrictions. Doctors prescribed it to patients worried about giving their children controlled substances. The medication proved less effective than stimulants for most patients, but its existence expanded the treatment market by capturing families who wouldn't consider traditional medications. Long-term studies on stimulant safety remained scarce despite millions of children taking the drugs for years. Most research focused on short-term efficacy. Does the medication improve behavior and grades? The answer was consistently yes, but studies examining effects after 5, 10, or 20 years of continuous use were almost non-existent. The longest follow-up studies tracked patients for maybe 3 years. What happened to brains exposed to daily stimulants throughout critical developmental periods? Nobody knew, because nobody had properly studied it. Animal research suggested potential concerns. Rats given methylphenidate during adolescence showed altered dopamine receptor development that persisted into adulthood. Their reward systems responded differently to stimuli compared to rats given placebo. Whether these findings translated to humans remained unclear, but they indicated that stimulant exposure during development might cause permanent neurochemical changes. Researchers published these findings in specialized journals where few parents or doctors would encounter them. The warnings never penetrated mainstream medical practice. Growth suppression emerged as a documented side effect. Children on stimulants grew more slowly than unmedicated peers, averaging 1 to 2 centimeters less height after several years of treatment. Pharmaceutical companies and doctors minimized this finding, calling it modest and clinically insignificant. Parents received reassurance that drug holidays during summers would allow catch-up growth. But the growth suppression indicated the medications were affecting bodies in measurable physical ways. If height was reduced, what other developmental processes might be altered? Appetite suppression was so common it barely counted as a side effect. It was simply expected. Most children on stimulants ate less, lost weight, required encouragement to consume adequate calories. Parents developed strategies for maximizing nutrition during the morning, before medication kicked in and the evening after it wore off. Some children developed genuinely concerning eating patterns, becoming so thin that doctors considered stopping medication. Most continued anyway, the behavioral benefits outweighing the nutritional concerns. Sleep disruption affected large numbers of medicated children. Stimulants remained active for hours, making it difficult to fall asleep even when doses were timed for morning administration. Doctors prescribed additional medications to counteract the sleep problems, clonidine or melatonin to help children fall asleep despite having stimulants in their systems. This polypharmacy approach of prescribing drugs to counteract side effects of other drugs became standard practice. Children took morning pills to focus and evening pills to sleep, their natural rhythms completely overridden by pharmaceutical management. The Schedule II classification theoretically indicated serious abuse potential and mandated strict prescribing controls. Doctors couldn't call in refills. Patients needed new written prescriptions each month. This inconvenience was supposed to prevent casual prescribing and diversion. But in practice, the requirements became routine bureaucracy that doctors and parents navigated without considering the implications. The Schedule II classification was simultaneously taken very seriously by pharmacies tracking every pill and completely ignored by the medical establishment prescribing millions of doses monthly. Stimulant medications became so normalized that taking them attracted minimal stigma. Children swallowed pills at school alongside peers doing the same. Classrooms had routines for medication time. Teachers reminded students to visit the nurse for their doses. The practice was public, unremarkable, and completely integrated into daily school operations. This normalization meant children never learned that their medication was fundamentally altering their brain chemistry. It was just part of their routine, like brushing teeth or eating breakfast. The generation prescribed Ritalin in elementary school during the early 1990s reached adolescence by 2000. Doctors faced new questions. Should teenagers continue medication? Most evidence suggested ADHD persisted into adolescence for many patients. Discontinuing medication often resulted in declining grades and behavioral problems, so prescriptions continued through middle school and into high school. The children who started taking stimulants at age 7 were still taking them at 15, having spent more than half their lives on daily medication. Nobody questioned whether 8 years of continuous stimulant exposure might create dependency beyond treating the original condition. The medications were working by the standard measures of grades and behavior. Questioning successful treatment seemed irrational, but those standard measures couldn't capture whether the patients had become unable to function without chemical assistance. That question wouldn't be asked seriously for another decade. By then, millions would already be dependent. The first generation prescribed Ritalin as children hit college campuses around 2001 carrying pill bottles and prescriptions from pediatricians they'd been seeing for a decade. These students had grown up taking stimulants daily, never experiencing high school or middle school without pharmaceutical assistance. College represented their first taste of real independence, which included managing their own medication without parental supervision. Many continued taking prescribed doses as directed. Others discovered their pills had unexpected value beyond treating ADHD symptoms. Roommates and friends noticed the effects. A student with an ADHD prescription could study for 12 hours straight, hyper-focused on textbooks and problem sets. They completed assignments with unusual intensity and thoroughness. During finals week, they seemed superhuman while everyone else struggled with exhaustion and distraction. Naturally, other students became curious. They asked to try a pill, offering cash or trading favors. Most students with prescriptions initially refused, uncomfortable with the idea of sharing medication, but persistence wore them down, especially when friends framed it as desperate academic need rather than drug dealing. The first transaction was always awkward and tentative. A prescribed student would hand over a single pill, accepting maybe $5 or $10. The buyer would swallow it nervously, unsure what to expect. Then came the revelation. The non-ADHD student experienced effects far more dramatic than the prescribed user. Suddenly they could focus with laser-like intensity. Boring reading became engaging. Complex problems became manageable. Hours passed in what felt like minutes as they worked with unprecedented productivity. This was better than coffee, better than energy drinks, better than anything legal they'd ever experienced. Word spread through dorms and campus social networks. Students discovered that Ritalin and Adderall were available from classmates with prescriptions. The drugs cost $20 to $50 per pill depending on supply and demand. During finals weeks, prices doubled or tripled. Students who'd never considered buying illegal drugs rationalized that these were legitimate medications prescribed by doctors. They weren't really drug dealing, just sharing medicine with people who needed it. The fact that money changed hands seemed incidental. A black market economy emerged on virtually every college campus. Students with ADHD prescriptions realized they were sitting on valuable assets. A monthly prescription of 60 pills could generate hundreds of dollars in revenue. Some prescribed students stopped taking their own medication entirely, selling every pill instead. Others took half their prescribed dose and sold the remainder. The financial incentives were significant for college students struggling with tuition and living expenses. Dealing prescription stimulants was profitable, relatively safe, and easily justified as helping desperate students succeed academically. Demand far exceeded supply from diverted prescriptions. Students without ADHD diagnoses began seeking their own prescriptions through campus health services. They researched symptoms online, learning which complaints triggered stimulant prescriptions. Difficulty concentrating during lectures? Check. Trouble completing long assignments? Check. Feeling restless during class? Check. The symptoms were vague enough that anyone could claim them convincingly. Campus doctors, overworked and facing long appointment queues, rarely investigated deeply. Students who wanted stimulants generally got them. The diagnostic process became theatre, where both parties played predetermined roles. Students recited symptoms from online checklists. Doctors asked standardized screening questions. Everyone knew the script. A student claiming they'd struggled with focus their entire life but never sought treatment was obviously lying, but doctors prescribed anyway. Refusing to prescribe meant longer appointments, potential complaints, and forcing students to seek medication through more dangerous black market channels. Writing a prescription took 30 seconds and solved everyone's immediate problem. Some students became remarkably sophisticated about gaming the system. They brought documentation from high school teachers describing attention problems. They mentioned struggling through standardized tests. They claimed previous diagnoses that were never properly treated. These performances were harder to dismiss than obvious fishing for drugs. Campus doctors found themselves prescribing to students who clearly wanted performance enhancement, but had assembled enough circumstantial evidence to justify treatment. The line between legitimate diagnosis and elaborate fraud dissolved completely. Competitive academic environments saw the highest stimulant use rates. Elite universities where students fought for top grades and prestigious job opportunities became stimulant-saturated. Studies estimated that 35% of students at schools like Dartmouth, Duke, and University of Pennsylvania had used prescription stimulants non-medically. At less competitive schools, rates were lower but still significant, perhaps 15 to 20%. The more intense the academic pressure, the more students turned to pharmaceutical enhancement. Engineering and pre-med students used stimulants most heavily. Their programs required brutal course loads and perfect grades for career advancement. Missing a few points on an exam could derail medical school applications or graduate program admissions. Stimulants offered a competitive edge that felt necessary rather than optional. Students rationalized that everyone else was using, so not using meant falling behind. This arms race mentality drove ever-increasing consumption. The drugs transformed study habits and social dynamics. Libraries filled with students on stimulants, working with mechanical intensity through the night. Natural sleep patterns gave way to pharmaceutical scheduling. Stimulants for studying, alcohol for socializing, more stimulants for recovering from alcohol, sleeping pills when stimulants prevented rest. Bodies became chemistry experiments optimized for academic productivity. Health was irrelevant compared to GPA. Some students discovered that crushing pills and snorting them produced faster, more intense effects. The extended release mechanisms designed to prevent abuse could be defeated with a pill crusher or mortar and pestle. Crushing bypassed the timed release coating, delivering the entire dose at once. Insufflation sent the drug directly into the bloodstream through nasal membranes, creating a rush similar to cocaine. This method of use was clearly drug abuse rather than medication, but students convinced themselves it was different because the drugs came from pharmacies rather than street dealers. The cocaine comparison wasn't rhetorical. Methylphenidate and amphetamines shared significant pharmacological similarities with cocaine. All three increased dopamine levels in the brain's reward centers. All three could be addictive. All three carried risks of cardiovascular problems, psychiatric side effects, and dependency. The main difference was legality and social perception. Cocaine was a dangerous street drug. Stimulant medications were doctor-approved. This distinction was legally meaningful but pharmacologically irrelevant. Students experienced classic signs of stimulant abuse. They took increasing doses to achieve the same effects as tolerance developed. They felt unable to study effectively without the drugs. They experienced crashes when effects wore off, exhaustion, depression, inability to focus. These were symptoms of dependency, but students interpreted them as proof they needed the medication. The drugs had become necessary for functioning at levels they'd previously achieved naturally. Campus health centers slowly recognized the problem, but struggled to address it. Doctors couldn't simply stop prescribing stimulants. Many students had legitimate ADHD diagnoses requiring treatment. Creating barriers to medication would harm those genuinely needing it, while barely slowing recreational use. Tighter prescribing standards might just push students towards street drugs. The situation had no good solutions, only trade-offs between bad options. Some universities implemented monitoring systems tracking students who requested multiple refills or sought prescriptions from multiple doctors. These programs caught the most obvious drug-seeking behavior but missed sophisticated users. Students learned to stick with single providers, report consistent symptoms, and avoid triggering red flags. The monitoring systems primarily punished unsophisticated users while allowing savvier students to continue accessing medication. Law enforcement occasionally conducted sting operations, arresting students caught selling pills. These prosecutions were intended as deterrents, but barely impacted overall use. For every student arrested, dozens continued selling without consequences. The risk was low, the profits were high, and the student population contained endless demand. Some dealing students even maintained they were providing a public service, helping peers access medication that overworked campus doctors couldn't prescribe fast enough. The normalization was perhaps most disturbing. Students discussed stimulant use openly, comparing brands and doses like discussing coffee preferences. Study groups coordinated dosing times so everyone peaked simultaneously. Resident advisors in dorms largely ignored the trade happening on their floors. Campus culture had absorbed stimulant use so thoroughly that it seemed unremarkable. These were good students using medication to study harder, not delinquents shooting heroin in stairwells. Parents remained largely oblivious. Students didn't mention their stimulant use during phone calls home. When they did, they framed it as responsible medication management or necessary academic support. Parents who'd spent years managing their children's ADHD prescriptions had normalized stimulant use and didn't question its continuation in college. Those whose children started using in college never learned about it at all. The pharmaceutical industry watched this emerging market with calculated interest. College students represented future adult patients. Normalizing stimulant use during university years created lifetime customers. Young professionals who'd used stimulants throughout college would naturally continue using them in demanding careers. The industry didn't need to directly market to college students. The peer-to-peer spread was more effective than any advertising campaign could be. Companies did market to campus health centers, ensuring stimulant prescriptions remained easy to obtain. Sales representatives visited university doctors, providing free samples and literature about adult ADHD. They emphasized how many college students had undiagnosed attention problems interfering with their academic potential. These marketing efforts weren't technically illegal or even unethical by pharmaceutical industry standards, but they were deliberately designed to expand prescription rates in a population with high rates of misuse. Graduation didn't end stimulant use for most students who'd adopted them during college. The medications had become integrated into their study routines and self-image. They'd succeeded academically while taking stimulants and attributed their success to the drugs. Stopping seemed irrational when facing the working world. Many continued refilling prescriptions long after graduating, transitioning from college study drug users to adult prescription stimulant users. The transformation from recreational use to dependency happened gradually enough that most never noticed crossing the line. The children prescribed Ritalin in elementary school during the 1990s had now spent 15 years on stimulants. The college students who started using in 2005 would spend the next 15 years continuing. Two overlapping generations were growing up with pharmaceutical stimulation as normal. Neither group would easily escape dependency. The drugs worked too well, the alternatives seemed too difficult, and nobody was seriously questioning whether this mass medication experiment might have consequences that wouldn't become apparent for decades. The pharmaceutical industry recognized an obvious problem around 2005. Children prescribed stimulants eventually turned 18 and aged out of pediatric care. Millions of young adults had been taking medication for years but faced uncertainty about continuing treatment. Adult psychiatrists were reluctant to prescribe stimulants for ADHD, viewing it as a childhood condition that resolved with maturity. This created a massive market about to evaporate unless someone redefined the disease itself. Researchers at Harvard and other institutions began publishing studies showing ADHD persisted into adulthood far more commonly than previously believed. The condition didn't disappear at 18, it simply manifested differently. Hyperactive children became restless adults. Inattentive students became disorganized employees. The core symptoms remained but expressed themselves through adult responsibilities rather than classroom behavior. These findings suggested 4 to 5% of adults had ADHD, most of them undiagnosed and untreated. Eli Lilly seized this research and built a marketing empire. The company had lost its Prozac patent in 2001 and desperately needed new revenue streams. Strattera, its non-stimulant ADHD medication, had disappointed in the children's market. But adult ADHD represented virgin territory. Lilly launched an aggressive campaign educating doctors and the public about adult symptoms. Advertisements showed frustrated professionals unable to focus during meetings, parents forgetting appointments, workers struggling with organization. The message was clear. If you're struggling with modern life's demands, you might have undiagnosed ADHD. Online screening questionnaires proliferated across the internet. These self-assessment tools asked questions so broad they captured almost anyone experiencing normal stress. Do you have trouble focusing on boring tasks? Do you sometimes procrastinate? Do you feel restless during long meetings? Answering yes to 6 out of 18 symptoms qualified for possible ADHD. The symptoms described normal human experiences under demanding conditions, but the questionnaires framed them as potential disease indicators requiring medical evaluation. Shire Pharmaceuticals, manufacturer of Adderall, launched similar campaigns with even more aggressive tactics. The company created partnerships with screening websites that directed users to physicians known for diagnosing adult ADHD liberally. They funded continuing medical education courses teaching doctors to recognize adult symptoms. The courses were technically educational rather than promotional, allowing Shire to influence prescribing patterns while maintaining plausibility that they weren't directly marketing to physicians. Adult diagnosis proved even more subjective than childhood diagnosis. No teacher checklists existed for adults. No objective measures of attention or focus applied to diverse adult lives. Psychiatrists relied entirely on patient self-reports of symptoms. Anyone who researched ADHD symptoms before their appointment could report them convincingly. Doctors had no reliable way to distinguish genuine ADHD from people seeking stimulants for performance enhancement, or someone simply struggling with a demanding job. The diagnostic process became remarkably streamlined. Patients complained of focus problems. Doctors asked screening questions. Patients answered affirmatively. Prescriptions were written. The entire evaluation might take 20 minutes. Some psychiatrists specialized in ADHD and saw dozens of patients daily in assembly line fashion. These high-volume practices were enormously profitable. Each 15-minute appointment generated hundreds in fees, and patients required monthly follow-ups for prescription refills. Insurance companies initially resisted covering adult ADHD treatment, viewing it as paying for performance enhancement rather than medical necessity. But pharmaceutical companies lobbied aggressively, emphasizing the disorder's impact on work productivity and economic costs of untreated adults. They funded studies showing that workers with untreated ADHD cost employers thousands annually in lost productivity. These arguments eventually convinced insurers that covering treatment was cheaper than allowing the condition to remain untreated. Telehealth platforms emerged in the 2000s and accelerated adult ADHD diagnosis exponentially. Companies like Cerebral, Dun & Ahead offered online evaluations through video chat. Patients completed questionnaires, spoke with a prescriber for 15 to 30 minutes, and received prescriptions within hours. The convenience was unprecedented. No waiting for appointments, no time off work, no in-person office visits. Just answer questions on a screen and receive medication by mail. These platforms optimized every aspect of the process to maximize prescription rates. The questionnaires were designed to identify symptoms rather than rule them out. Prescribers were measured on patient satisfaction, not diagnostic accuracy. Patients who didn't receive prescriptions complained and left negative reviews, while those who got medication became loyal subscribers paying monthly fees. The business model incentivized saying yes to nearly everyone who requested treatment. Cerebral's internal documents, later revealed through whistleblower reports, showed the company explicitly instructed prescribers to maintain high prescription rates. Nurse practitioners who diagnosed too conservatively received warnings about low conversion rates. The company tracked what percentage of evaluations resulted in prescriptions and pushed providers toward industry benchmarks of 80% or higher. This wasn't medicine, it was sales optimization disguised as healthcare. Traditional psychiatrists watched this development with growing alarm. Organizations like the American Psychiatric Association issued warnings about online prescription mills undermining diagnostic integrity. State medical boards began investigating telehealth platforms for inappropriate prescribing. But regulation moved slowly while the platforms operated at internet speed. By the time investigations concluded and restrictions were implemented, millions had already received prescriptions through these services. The COVID-19 pandemic supercharged online prescribing. Regulations restricting telehealth were temporarily suspended to maintain healthcare access during lockdowns. Controlled substance prescriptions, previously requiring in-person visits, could now be written after video consultations. These emergency measures were intended to help legitimate patients during a crisis. Instead, they opened the floodgates to unprecedented stimulant prescribing with minimal oversight. Stimulant prescriptions increased 25% during 2020 and another 20% in 2021. The growth wasn't driven by sudden ADHD epidemic or pandemic-related attention problems. It resulted from elimination of barriers that had previously limited access to controlled substances. Telehealth platforms scaled nationally, advertising on social media and targeting young adults. Getting an ADHD diagnosis and prescription became easier than ordering food delivery. The medications genuinely helped some adults. People who'd struggled their entire lives with organization, focus, and impulse control found relief through treatment. They finally understood why tasks that seemed easy for others had always been impossibly difficult for them. Medication allowed them to function at levels they'd never achieved before. These success stories were real and meaningful. They were also minority outcomes drowning in an ocean of questionable prescriptions written to people who didn't have ADHD. The cultural narrative around productivity made stimulant use seem not just acceptable, but necessary. Modern work demanded constant availability, rapid task switching, and sustained focus despite endless distractions. Employers expected employees to work like machines, tireless, consistent, always optimized. Stimulants allowed humans to approximate machine-like performance. Taking them wasn't cheating or drug abuse, it was adapting to unreasonable systemic demands through available tools. Silicon Valley normalized and even celebrated stimulant use. Tech workers openly discussed their Adderall prescriptions as performance enhancements. Startup culture glorified extreme productivity and all-night coding sessions enabled by pharmaceutical stimulation. Venture capitalists joked about which founders were obviously on Adderall during pitch meetings. The stigma had inverted. Not taking stimulants seemed naive or inefficient rather than healthy. Finance, law, and consulting saw similar patterns. Industries demanding extreme work hours and perfect performance created environments where stimulant use was nearly mandatory for competitive success. Associates at major law firms worked 100-hour weeks that were only sustainable with pharmaceutical assistance. Investment bankers pulled all-nighters analyzing deals while dosed on stimulants. Management consultants maintained brutal travel schedules while remaining sharp in client meetings through careful medication timing. Women represented a growing proportion of adult ADHD diagnoses, reversing the childhood pattern where boys outnumbered girls 4-1. Adult diagnosis rates were nearly equal between sexes. This shift partly reflected recognition that ADHD manifested differently in girls and women, less hyperactivity, more inattention. But it also indicated that stimulants solved problems adult women faced in balancing careers, parenting, and household management. The drugs helped manage impossible expectations rather than treating genuine neurological disorders. Marketing specifically targeted overwhelmed mothers. Advertisements showed women juggling work calls while helping kids with homework, forgetting appointments, struggling with clutter. The imagery was designed to resonate with the second shift, women who worked full-time but retained primary responsibility for childcare and housework. A DHD diagnosis offered medical explanation for failing to successfully manage unrealistic demands. Stimulants provided the energy and focus to maintain unsustainable schedules. The medications created their own necessity. Adults who started taking stimulants found their baseline productivity insufficient without them. Tasks that once felt manageable became impossibly difficult when unmedicated. This wasn't necessarily because they had ADHD, it was because their brains had adapted to constant stimulation. Dopamine receptors downregulated in response to artificial dopamine increases, making natural dopamine signaling inadequate. The drugs altered brain chemistry in ways that made continued use seem necessary. Tolerance developed predictably. Doses that initially provided dramatic benefits gradually became less effective. Users increased their doses or took additional pills beyond prescriptions. Doctors often accommodated these requests, interpreting tolerance as disease progression, requiring higher doses rather than as adaptation indicating dependency. Prescriptions climbed from 10 milligrams daily to 20, then 40, then 60. Some adults took doses that would have been considered dangerous or abusive a decade earlier. The line between treatment and enhancement had always been arbitrary, but it vanished entirely with adult ADHD. Were highly successful professionals taking stimulants to treat disease or optimize performance? Many had experienced no impairment before diagnosis. They held demanding jobs, maintained relationships, functioned effectively. The drugs made them function better, but that didn't mean they'd been dysfunctional before. They were performance-enhancing drugs prescribed as medicine because modern psychiatry had expanded disease definitions until normal variation became pathology. Pharmaceutical companies profited enormously from adult market expansion. Shire's annual revenue from ADHD medications exceeded $3 billion by 2010. Takeda acquired Shire in 2019 for $62 billion, largely based on the ADHD portfolio's value. These weren't niche medications for rare conditions. They were blockbuster drugs for conditions affecting millions, with patients requiring indefinite daily treatment. Wall Street analysts praised the business model's recurring revenue and patient stickiness. By 2020, over 16 million Americans took prescription stimulants. Children still represented significant numbers, but adults had become the growth market. The children prescribed Ritalin in the 1990s were now adults in their 30s, many still taking medication they'd been on for 25 years. The college students who started using in the 2000s were now established professionals dependent on daily stimulation. New adults were diagnosed constantly through telehealth platforms and aggressive marketing. 3 overlapping generations were chemically dependent on amphetamines, and almost nobody was asking whether this represented a public health crisis or a triumph of modern psychiatry. Sarah stopped taking Adderall at age 28 after 12 continuous years on stimulants and discovered she couldn't remember what normal felt like. The first day without medication brought crushing fatigue that made getting out of bed feel impossible. Her thoughts moved like sludge through clogged pipes. Work tasks that usually took minutes required hours of forced concentration. By afternoon, she'd given up and taken half a pill just to function minimally. This pattern repeated for weeks. Attempts to quit followed by desperate returns to medication when withdrawal became unbearable. She wasn't alone. Online forums filled with similar stories from people who'd been prescribed stimulants as children and never successfully stopped. They described the same symptoms: profound exhaustion, inability to focus, depression that felt like drowning, and creeping certainty that their brains were permanently broken. Some had been diagnosed with legitimate ADHD. Others suspected they'd simply been energetic children medicated into compliance. After a decade or more on stimulants, the distinction no longer mattered. Their brains had adapted to constant chemical stimulation. Neuroplasticity meant that brains exposed to daily amphetamines for years underwent fundamental restructuring. Dopamine receptors downregulated, reducing the brain sensitivity to natural dopamine signaling. Neural pathways involved in motivation and reward became dependent on pharmaceutical enhancement. These changes persisted long after stopping medication, potentially permanently. Research on this phenomenon remained limited because nobody wanted to fund studies suggesting that widely prescribed medications caused lasting brain damage. The medical establishment refused to acknowledge dependency as a widespread problem. Doctors distinguish between physical dependence and psychological addiction, claiming stimulants cause the former, but rarely the latter. This semantic distinction was meaningless to patients who couldn't function without their medication. Whether you called it dependence or addiction, the result was the same. People trapped on drugs they'd initially taken to improve their lives but now needed just to feel normal. Marcus had been prescribed Ritalin at age 8 for fidgeting in class. Now 32, he'd never experienced adult life without stimulants. He'd tried stopping several times, always with the same results. Within days, his work performance collapsed. Simple emails required enormous effort. Meetings felt incomprehensible. His boss noticed the decline and suggested he seemed depressed or burned out. Marcus returned to his psychiatrist and restarted medication. interpreting withdrawal symptoms as proof he needed the drugs rather than as evidence of dependency. This interpretation was nearly universal among long-term users. They couldn't distinguish between ADHD symptoms returning and withdrawal effects from stopping stimulants. Both produced inability to focus, lack of motivation, and difficulty completing tasks. Doctors reinforced the disease model explanation, rarely suggesting that years of stimulant use might have created the very symptoms it supposedly treated. Patients who stopped medication and felt terrible concluded they had ADHD requiring lifelong treatment, not that they developed drug dependency requiring detoxification. Emergency room visits for stimulant-related problems increased dramatically through the 2000s and 10s. Young adults arrived with racing hearts, chest pain, and anxiety attacks after taking excessive doses. Some had stayed awake for days using stimulants continuously. Others mixed them with alcohol or other drugs, creating dangerous interactions. ER doctors stabilized these patients with benzodiazepines and fluids, then sent them home with warnings that were promptly ignored. The patients usually had legitimate prescriptions, which somehow made the abuse seem less serious than if they'd been using street drugs. Rehab centers began admitting patients specifically for stimulant addiction around 2015. These facilities had traditionally focused on alcohol, opioids, and cocaine, but counselors noticed increasing numbers of clients whose primary problem was prescription stimulants. These patients didn't fit stereotypical addict profiles. They were often successful professionals, parents, college graduates with good jobs. Their addiction was high-functioning until suddenly it wasn't. Treatment for stimulant dependency proved challenging. No medications existed to ease withdrawal the way methadone or buprenorphine helped opioid addicts. Patients simply had to endure weeks of crushing fatigue and dysfunction while their brains slowly readjusted to operating without chemical enhancement. Most relapsed within days. The withdrawal was too severe, the performance impact too dramatic, the medication too easily accessible through existing prescriptions. Successful recovery required completely restructuring one's life to function at lower productivity levels, which seemed impossible in demanding careers. Jennifer had taken Adderall throughout law school and her first 5 years practicing corporate law. She worked 80-hour weeks reviewing contracts and preparing filings. Without medication, she couldn't maintain the pace. She tried stopping multiple times, always relapsing within a week when work piled up. Her prescription came from a psychiatrist who never questioned whether she genuinely had ADHD or was simply dependent on performance-enhancing drugs. The doctor increased her dose whenever she reported tolerance, interpreting it as disease progression rather than addiction. High-functioning addiction became normalized across professional environments. Colleagues compared prescriptions and doses at happy hours. They joked about needing their Adderall to survive Monday mornings or finish projects by deadlines. The humour masked genuine dependency, but everyone was dependent together, which made it seem normal. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that an entire professional class was relying on daily amphetamines to meet artificially inflated productivity expectations. The medications altered personalities in ways users rarely recognized. Stimulants increased focus but often narrowed it into rigid tunnel vision. They enhanced task completion but reduced creativity and spontaneity. They provided energy but sometimes manifested as irritability or aggression. Long-term users became different people, more productive but less flexible, more driven but less joyful. Friends and family noticed these changes, but users attributed them to maturity or career demands rather than chronic stimulant use. Relationships suffered under the weight of dependency. Partners complained that users were only truly present when medicated, checked out and irritable otherwise. Parents on stimulants were efficient at managing household logistics, but emotionally distant from their children. The medications helped people function in modern society's demanding environments, but potentially at the cost of deeper human connections and authentic emotional experience. Sleep architecture deteriorated after years of stimulant use. Users developed chronic insomnia requiring prescription sleep medications. They took stimulants to wake up, stimulants to stay alert throughout the day, alcohol or marijuana to unwind in the evening, and sleeping pills to actually fall asleep. This pharmaceutical cycle became so routine that users didn't recognize how bizarre it was, using drugs to artificially control every aspect of their circadian rhythm. Cardiovascular risks accumulated silently. Stimulants increased heart rate and blood pressure every single day for years. Long-term users faced elevated risks of heart attacks, strokes, and arrhythmias. These risks were known but considered acceptable trade-offs for the drug's benefits. Doctors monitored blood pressure and heart rate at appointments, but rarely suggested stopping medication even when cardiovascular parameters crept into concerning ranges. They just prescribed additional medications to control the blood pressure that stimulants elevated. Weight became another chronic issue. Appetite suppression that seemed beneficial initially led to poor nutrition and underweight bodies after years of use. Some users forgot to eat entirely, consuming minimal calories and losing muscle mass. Others developed disordered eating patterns, only managing meals when unmedicated or forcing food despite having no appetite. The metabolic effects of chronic stimulant use remained poorly studied, but anecdotal reports suggested lasting damage to natural hunger signals. Psychiatric side effects emerged in substantial numbers of long-term users. Anxiety disorders developed or worsened. Some users experienced paranoia or psychotic symptoms, particularly at high doses. Depression became common during evening crashes when medication wore off. These psychiatric problems often prompted additional prescriptions: antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, mood stabilizers. Users ended up on multiple psychiatric drugs, all attempting to manage side effects or symptoms that might not have existed before stimulant use began. The children prescribed Ritalin in the 1990s were reaching their mid-30s by 2020. Many had been on stimulants for 25 years, their entire childhoods, adolescences, and adult lives. They'd never held jobs without medication. They'd never maintained relationships while unmedicated. Their brains had been shaped by decades of daily amphetamine exposure during critical developmental periods. What this meant for their long-term health remained unknown because no studies had tracked patients for that duration. Anecdotal reports suggested troubling patterns. Online communities dedicated to quitting stimulants filled with stories of people who'd taken medications for decades and felt their cognition was permanently impaired. They described difficulty experiencing pleasure, motivation, or focus even years after stopping. Some called this condition post-acute withdrawal syndrome. Others thought they had permanent brain damage. Medical research barely acknowledged the phenomenon, leaving patients with no official diagnosis or treatment for what they were experiencing. Doctors who prescribed stimulants to children in the 1990s never anticipated creating lifelong dependency. They'd believed they were treating a medical condition that would resolve with maturity, or at least remain manageable with medication. The idea that these children would become adults, unable to function without daily amphetamines, seemed far-fetched when writing those initial prescriptions. But medicine had conducted a mass experiment without control groups or long-term follow-up, and the results were finally becoming apparent. Some psychiatrists began questioning the entire paradigm. Were millions genuinely diseased, or had society pathologized normal human variation? Were medications treating ADHD, or creating dependency that mimicked ADHD symptoms when stopped? The questions were uncomfortable because the answers suggested decades of medical practice might have caused more harm than benefit. Questioning stimulant prescriptions meant questioning fundamental assumptions about psychiatric diagnosis and treatment. Pharmaceutical companies faced minimal accountability. They'd marketed medications aggressively, expanded diagnostic criteria, funded research supporting their products, and profited enormously. But they'd broken no laws. Everything was FDA approved, properly prescribed by licensed physicians, and scientifically supported by research they'd funded. The system worked exactly as designed, maximizing drug sales while maintaining plausible deniability about creating mass dependency. The addiction pipeline was complete. Children were diagnosed young and started on stimulants. They continued through adolescence, unable to function academically without medication. They transitioned to college, where drugs that treated their diagnosed condition also enhanced their performance. They became adults who'd been medicated so long they couldn't imagine life without it. They continued indefinitely, dependent on pills to maintain the productivity that modern society demanded. Some genuinely needed the medication. Many others were simply trapped in a cycle of dependency that began when they were too young to consent and too old to escape, without devastating consequences. The stimulant shortage of 2022 exposed just how dependent American society had become on these medications. Manufacturing issues at major pharmaceutical plants combined with explosive demand growth created supply chain collapse. Pharmacies ran out of Adderall completely. Generic alternatives disappeared from shelves. Patients who'd taken stimulants for years suddenly couldn't refill prescriptions. Panic spread through online communities as millions faced involuntary withdrawal. The FDA issued statements about supply normalization within months, but months meant prolonged suffering for dependent patients. Workers missed deadlines and lost jobs. Students failed exams. Parents struggled to manage households. The withdrawal wasn't just uncomfortable, it was functionally disabling for people whose entire lives had been structured around medicated performance. Some turned to illicit sources, buying pills from dealers or overseas pharmacies. Others switched between whatever medications they could find, creating chaotic dosing patterns that worsened their situations. Insurance companies received thousands of appeals from patients begging for coverage of brand-name medications when generics were unavailable. The brand versions cost hundreds of dollars monthly without insurance. Patients who'd been paying $20 copays suddenly faced impossible choices between medication and rent. Some maxed out credit cards. Others went without, suffering through withdrawal while trying to maintain employment and family responsibilities. The shortage revealed that millions of Americans were one supply chain disruption away from crisis. Telehealth platforms collapsed under regulatory scrutiny during this same period. Cerebral faced multiple investigations for inappropriate prescribing practices. The company's founder resigned amid revelations that internal metrics prioritize prescription rates over diagnostic accuracy. Dunn and Ahead received similar scrutiny. State medical boards began revoking licenses of nurse practitioners who'd prescribed stimulants too liberally through these platforms. The crackdown was necessary but poorly timed. It restricted access precisely when shortages were already creating desperation. Some patients discovered they'd been misdiagnosed all along. When forced to stop medication due to shortages, they experienced withdrawal symptoms but ultimately functioned fine without treatment. These individuals realized they'd been taking stimulants for years despite never having ADHD. They'd responded to vague symptoms matching diagnostic criteria, but didn't actually have the underlying condition. The medications had worked because stimulants improve focus and productivity in everyone, not just people with ADHD. This revelation was simultaneously liberating and infuriating. They'd been unnecessarily dependent on controlled substances because of loose diagnostic standards. Others genuinely struggled and confirmed their diagnoses through involuntary medication discontinuation. Their lives deteriorated rapidly without treatment. Work performance collapsed, relationships frayed, daily functioning became impossible. These patients desperately needed medication and suffered immensely during the shortage. Their experiences were completely valid, but got lost in broader controversies about overprescription and dependency. Legitimate ADHD patients found themselves defending their need for medication against growing skepticism. Research finally began emerging on long-term outcomes for children prescribed stimulants. A comprehensive study published in 2023 tracked individuals diagnosed with ADHD in childhood for 25 years. The results were complicated and disturbing. Medication improved short-term academic outcomes and reduced behavioral problems. But long-term effects were minimal or negative. Medicated children didn't achieve better life outcomes than unmedicated ones with similar initial ADHD symptoms. They had similar employment rates, income levels, relationship stability, and life satisfaction. What they did have was higher rates of substance abuse and ongoing psychiatric medication use. The study suggested that stimulants helped children conform to school expectations but provided no lasting benefits once they left structured educational environments. The medications managed symptoms without addressing underlying problems. Worse, early exposure to addictive substances might have increased vulnerability to later addiction. The researchers cautiously suggested that less aggressive medication approaches might produce better long-term outcomes, though they couldn't prove causation from correlational data. Pharmaceutical companies immediately disputed the findings. They funded counter-studies showing benefits from treatment. Industry-sponsored researchers criticized the methodology and interpretation. Medical journals became battlegrounds for competing interpretations of the same data. But the damage to stimulant medication's reputation had been done. Parents who'd unquestioningly medicated their children based on teacher recommendations began having serious doubts. European countries had maintained far more conservative prescribing practices than America and provided natural comparison groups. France prescribed stimulants at 1/10 the US rate. The children weren't doing worse academically or professionally. If anything, they seemed healthier. Lower rates of anxiety, depression, and substance abuse in young adults. The cultural differences in how societies viewed childhood behavior rather than biological differences in ADHD prevalence seemed to explain prescription disparities. Some US school districts began questioning whether they'd over-relied on medication to manage classroom behavior. A few implemented alternative approaches: smaller class sizes, more recess time, different teaching methods that accommodated active children. These changes produced behavioral improvements comparable to medication without the dependency risks. But such reforms required funding and effort that most districts couldn't or wouldn't invest. Medication remained the path of the least resistance despite growing evidence of its limitations. The children prescribed Ritalin in the 1990s were now parents facing their own decisions about medicating their kids. Many chose differently than their parents had. They'd experienced firsthand what decades of stimulant use did: the dependency, the withdrawal, the inability to function naturally. They watched their children display similar energy and inattention that had led to their own diagnoses and decided to try other approaches first. Some refused medication entirely despite school pressure. Others were more cautious, using it sparingly rather than daily. But other parents from the same generation took the opposite approach. Their stimulant use had enabled their success. They'd graduated college, built careers, and maintained middle-class lives. They attributed these achievements to medication and wanted the same advantages for their children. They sought early diagnosis and treatment, believing that starting young prevented years of unnecessary struggle. both groups were operating from genuine experience, reaching opposite conclusions about the same medications. Social media amplified every perspective simultaneously. Reddit communities dedicated to quitting stimulants shared horror stories of withdrawal and dependency. Instagram influencers posted about how ADHD diagnosis changed their lives for the better. TikTok videos went viral showing the dramatic effects of taking Adderall for the first time. Twitter threads debated whether ADHD was overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed, with both sides marshalling evidence and personal anecdotes. The discourse generated more heat than light, leaving confused parents and patients unsure what to believe. Medical organizations attempted to issue updated guidelines reflecting current evidence. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommended that behavioral interventions be tried before medication for young children. The American Psychiatric Association tightened diagnostic criteria to reduce false positives. These recommendations were reasonable and evidence-based, but they were also largely ignored in practice. Doctors continued prescribing as they always had. Parents continued requesting medication. Schools continued recommending evaluations. The system had too much momentum to redirect through professional guidelines. Lawsuits began emerging from adults who'd been prescribed stimulants as children and developed substance abuse problems. They claimed pharmaceutical companies had downplayed addiction risks and marketed too aggressively to children. The cases faced uphill battles. The medications were FDA approved, properly prescribed, and the plaintiffs couldn't prove causation between childhood stimulant use and later addiction. But the lawsuits generated publicity that further damaged public perception of these drugs. Generic manufacturers had captured most of the market by 2024, reducing pharmaceutical company profits from stimulants. The drugs remained profitable, but less so than during the early 2000s boom years. Companies shifted research toward new mechanisms and formulations. They developed prodrug versions that required metabolic activation, theoretically reducing abuse potential. They created medications combining stimulants with abuse-deterrent technology. These innovations extended patent protection while addressing safety concerns that were becoming harder to ignore. Workplace accommodation requests for ADHD increased dramatically, creating legal and practical challenges for employers. Workers with diagnoses requested schedule flexibility, reduced meetings, quiet workspaces, and deadline extensions. These accommodations were legally required under disability law, but they created tensions with co-workers who didn't have diagnoses and received no accommodations despite facing the same productivity demands. Some employees sought ADHD diagnoses primarily to access workplace protections rather than for medical treatment. The productivity culture that had driven stimulant adoption began facing broader criticism. Workers burned out from unsustainable demands questioned whether anyone should need pharmaceutical enhancement to meet basic job requirements. Maybe the problem wasn't individual neurology, but systemic expectations that humans work like machines. This analysis suggested that stimulant epidemic was a symptom of late-stage capitalism rather than a public health crisis, though such framing was controversial and politically charged. Insurance coverage began tightening in response to unsustainable costs. Stimulant prescriptions had become enormous expense categories for insurers. Some companies implemented prior authorization requirements, forcing doctors to justify prescriptions before approval. Others limited quantities or mandated generic substitution. These cost control measures created barriers for patients, but also reduced inappropriate prescribing. The financial pressures where medical guidelines had failed. By 2025, America faced a reckoning about what it had created. Over 20 million people took prescription stimulants, 6 million children, and 14 million adults. The numbers had plateaued after years of exponential growth, but remained staggeringly high. Multiple generations had been raised on these medications. The full consequences wouldn't be known for decades, when today's medicated children became elderly adults, and researchers could finally assess lifetime outcomes. The medications had genuinely helped millions. People with severe ADHD who couldn't function without treatment had been given tools to succeed in education and careers. Children who might have dropped out of school had graduated. Adults who couldn't hold jobs had built stable careers. These benefits were real and shouldn't be dismissed. But they coexisted with massive collateral damage. People unnecessarily medicated, dependency created, childhood development altered, billions in profits extracted from a system that pathologized normal human variation. The question wasn't whether stimulants were good or bad. Pharmacology doesn't work in such simple terms. The question was whether American society had deployed these powerful tools wisely or recklessly. The evidence increasingly suggested the latter. Diagnostic criteria had been too loose, prescribing too casual, long-term safety monitoring too minimal, profit incentives too powerful. A medication that might have helped a small percentage of severely affected individuals had been prescribed to 10% of children and 6% of adults. Other countries watched America's experiment with mixture of curiosity and concern. They saw both the benefits and the costs. Some increased their own prescribing, convinced by evidence of treatment effectiveness. Others maintained conservative approaches, skeptical of medicalizing normal childhood behavior. The global pharmaceutical market pushed toward American-style treatment patterns, but cultural resistance remained strong in places where childhood was allowed to include energy and inattention without pathological labels. The children prescribed Ritalin in the 1990s were completing the cycle, becoming parents deciding whether to medicate their own children. This generation carried unique knowledge. They'd lived the entire experiment from beginning to end. They'd experienced the benefits and the costs, the dependency and the functionality, the questions and the consequences. Their decisions would shape the next generation's relationship with these drugs. Whether they'd repeat their parents' choices or choose differently remained to be seen. What was certain was that Ritalin and its pharmaceutical cousins had fundamentally altered multiple generations' brain chemistry, childhood experiences and relationships with productivity. The full reckoning for that alteration was still unfolding and would continue for decades. Medicine had conducted a mass experiment on millions without proper controls or long-term safety monitoring. The results were mixed at best and potentially catastrophic at worst, and nobody could undo what had already been done to the brains of those who'd spent their developing years under daily pharmaceutical stimulation.